the secrecy bill. It's been hotly debated for quite some time. And the truth of the matter is that the last time we saw a bill similar to this one that is actually now being debated is during the apartheid era. Give us an indication of what BUSA's thoughts are with regards to the secrecy bill.
Well, I think from the BUSA, or should I say from the business point of view, the important link here is between good governance and a country's economic performance. And the point of departure must be that certainly in the private sector, whether you look at the New Companies Act or at the King reports, we are holding the private sector to high standards of accountability and transparency. And I think this must also apply to the public sector. And if you look at the analyses of how countries perform around the world, quite clearly they're being challenged more and more about their accountability and their transparency. So the important issue here isn't that, as it now stands, this draft piece of legislation has been well panel beaten into something which is broadly acceptable to all the political parties except for the overarching public interest clause. That's really what BUSA is saying. We're saying, look, the issue, for example, of corruption, where light is the best policeman, subject to certain security, obviously, considerations, we should have that clause in the legislation. And that is really, I think, the big residual, the sort of big ticket item that has caused a lot of concern.
Okay, well, what kind of impact is it going to have on business going forward? Because in a sense, this, if of course it is implemented in the country and it does become legislation, it could actually create quite a bit of fear, and therefore corruption might be looked at differently by journalists or investigative journalists that would want to, of course, delve into a story that otherwise would be viewed as a hot potato.
Well, obviously what markets want in their different forms is a reliable source of information, and they look to the media for that, for a large part of that. So from the point of view of us as a developing country want to hold ourselves to high standards of investigation about corruption, we must be prepared to have a legal framework which makes that possible, which makes it possible to probe and to highlight, especially in the world of today, where even under the United Nations, there is a strong initiative globally to stamp out corruption. So quite clearly, there is an expectation not only from the private sector, but also from government to hold itself to those standards and to create a legal framework in which that is possible, subject once again to the normal security factors.
Exactly. This is what I want to mention, because the alternative and opposing view is the fact that the law is needed to safeguard certain state secrets. So how does one find a balance with
Yes, but this is not a blank check. I mean, when one says there is a public interest factor, it will have to be tested, and it will be tested on a case-by-case basis. What you do not want is a legal framework that makes it possible to sweep anything under the carpet which should be in the public domain, which is important for the business community to know, for the rating agencies to know, all those who evaluate the performance of a country. So I think the important factor from the BUSA point of view is simply, can we have another look at the public interest clause to see whether that overarching consideration can be met in the light of the concerns.
For example, Archbishop Desmond Tutu is also opposing the bill quite extensively. We've got quite a few voices that have actually now said that it needs to be reviewed. Do you think that government is going to budge on this?
Well, let's put it this way, that the process is not completed. This draft legislation still has to go to the National Council of Provinces. It still has to be signed by the President eventually. So there are further steps in the process, which I think certainly from the BUSA point of view, we hope will be an opportunity to further engage, to see whether this gap can be bridged so that we can send out a more positive message about how we want to deal with the public interest factor.
And of course, Raymond, you mentioned the factor when it comes to corruption, and with regards to the competitive factor, we are starting to slip down the ranks with regards to global surveys, and this could impact us going forward.
Well, if you look at the latest global competitive survey, what you find is that in the corporate sector, where we're being held to increasingly higher standards, we're number 4 or 5, but in the public sector we're much lower down. So clearly we don't want any hostages to fortune here. So if a way can be found to deal and address with the public interest factor, I think it would send out a very positive message and make sure that we have the necessary basis on which to deal with any corrupt activities, be they in the public or the private sector.
With regards to comparing an information bill such as this one relative to what we see in the more developed economies, where do we stand right now? Are we making unnecessary noise?
Well, I think if you look at the other pieces of legislation we have, they're actually quite good. They're actually quite up to date, and quite a lot of cases have been prosecuted. Now, what you don't want to do is to neutralize what work we're doing so far, both in the public and the private sector, through certain structures to indeed combat corruption. Of course, there's a lot more to do. Of course, it's a big problem, and that very global competitive survey that I've mentioned lists, in fact, corruption as among the top 4 factors which complicate the doing of business in South Africa. So quite clearly, we want to make quite sure that we do nothing else somewhere else that will jeopardize our ability to be able to combat corruption. And I think that's an important concern on the part of the business community.